ZOAC committee members. Roll call, Ms. Blair, not present. Ms. Bagley?
Here.
Mr. Baring? Mr. Hall?
Present.
Mr. Reeves? Not present. And Mr. McGregor? Not present. Chairwoman Hampton?
Present.
Okay. Yep.
So we have a quorum, so we'll call the meeting to order at 9:05 a.m. this morning. Good morning to everyone. I think you may have heard, I'll make one announcement. We do have a new member joining our ZOAC. Many of you will remember Enrique McGregor. He was appointed and will be joining us as a member of ZOAC, and we look forward to having us. He is anticipated to be here today, so when you see his face, we'll be excited to have him with us. So with that, Ms. Levy, can we read the item into the record, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. DCA 212003, consideration of amending permanent and temporary concrete or asphalt batching plant uses, including but not limited to amending potentially incompatible industrial uses in the Dallas Development Code.
Thank you. And I know we had an updated case report. Did you have an update for the members from our last briefing?
Yes, ma'am. Madam Chair, I'm sorry. I heard you say an updated case report.
Yes.
But yes, ma'am. That is correct.
Yes, I was just asking if you could give us an overview of the updates from our last briefing.
Oh, certainly. Yes. Basically, the updates are four of the questions that were asked by the commission or committee, I'm sorry, ZOAC committee. And I put the responses in there. I do have those questions in my presentation as well that I was going to go over. If that's acceptable, I can, discuss that as part of the presentation.
That'd be great. Thank you, Ms. Levy.
I found somebody in the parking lot and I decided to bring them with me. Good morning. Good morning. And good morning and I'm sorry.
Yeah, we called the meeting. We called the meeting. So as Ms. Levy's pulling that up, Commissioner Blair has joined us and Mr. McGregor as well. And I'll also acknowledge that Commissioner Carpenter is with us today for the briefing, for the meeting.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Would you like me to start?
Yes, please. I think we've got everybody's, we're getting settled. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, again, this is a follow-up discussion of our concrete or asphalt batching plant. And in our last meeting on February 10th, if you recall, staff presented recommendations for phase 1 of a 2-phased approach. And we mainly concentrated on the temporary batching plant uses. Today, we will go over the permanent batching plant uses as well. But again, just to recap, our purpose of bringing this code amendment forward is we initiated the code amendments in support of the CCAP, the Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Action Plan goal, which is to ensure that new industries are an appropriate distance away from neighborhoods. And again, that's protection of the sensitive uses, such as the residences, parks, and schools. And, we still want to obviously provide appropriate locations for our batching plant operations. We just want to do it responsibly. And, again, this is just, showing you basically what the use involves, with the sand piles, the aggregate piles, and the conveyor belts and the completely outdoor uses. They do have buildings, but for the most part, they are outdoors. And then, of course, a lot of them are, as we know, adjacent to residential neighborhoods. So again, in recapping about the temporary concrete and asphalt batching plants, as we know right now, in the code, they are permitted in virtually all districts, including residential, including some PDs, with special authorization of the building official, meaning they are an administrative process, a staff level approval. So that involves no public hearing, no public notifications required for the use. So again, we wanted to talk about the permanent concrete and batching plants today. And in the code right now, the word permanent is not included. It is not a category. So the use of a permanent asphalt or concrete batching plant falls under section 51A 4.203 industrial uses, and more specifically, an industrial use outside. And so because of that, they're allowed in the IM, the industrial district IM, with RAR required only. In other words, no public hearing process. They're by right in IM. So additionally, because that use is not listed as a potentially incompatible industrial use, it is not required to have an SUP to locate. And so that is why we changed the caption as well, just to be a little bit more specific. It is an industrial use, but it is handled as an outdoor industrial use. So currently, under that category, it is going to be allowed by SUP in the IR district and then by right in the IM district. So again, just to recap again about the two-phased approach, the whole purpose is really to address that lack of the public hearing process. And so we're removing the administrative and by right approval process for the temporary concrete and asphalt batching plants, and then also, of course, for the permanent as far as the IM district now. So recapping phase one, we want to add the public process for the asphalt and concrete batching plants, both temporary and permanent, by removing the administrative and by right approval process for temporary concrete or asphalt batching plants and the permanent batching plants allowed by code. We're adding in the SUP process. Again, that requires public hearings, which requires the public notification and also approval by both the city CPC, City Plan Commission, and City Council approval. So that's a full process with public hearings. And then by adding the concrete batching and then asphalt batching language into the subsection with potentially incompatible industrial uses, that is how we now, the permanent batching plants would now be permitted only by SUP in the IM district. Again, staff recommendation today, move phase one recommendation to require the SUPs as listed in your case report. To move phase one recommendation require the asphalt and concrete batching plants to the potentially incompatible industrial uses in IM zoning, and staff will continue to be working on phase two, or future consideration by ZOAC. So in our last meeting, ZOAC did raise some great questions and concerns that you asked us to take a look at for part of phase two, and I did put those in your case report, but what you had asked was about buffering and spacing of concrete and asphalt batching plans from these sensitive uses that we discussed before, residential, schools, and parks, and also suggested the Dallas oil and gas drilling ordinance to be looked at as a resource. So again, just, recapping, we will definitely take a look at that. Going to continue to review other city regulations, best management practices, health industry standards. But we also do want to get some public input, so we want to hold some public meetings to get that input, and that'll help us to determine the appropriate buffer and spacing for Dallas. That they're kind of all over the map with other cities. We certainly want to come up with what is specifically appropriate for Dallas. And we'll bring that back to ZOAC, of course, as part of phase 2 recommendations. Also, ZOAC asked about consideration of an environmental study to determine if the site is suitable for uses other than industrial once that use leaves the site. Staff will review those options, again, that are appropriate for Dallas to consider language that could be included so that we make sure that the site is restored back to original condition when the operation ceases. I did want to mention on this one, though, a couple of things. An environmental study is usually performed by an environmental scientist or specialist, so it's a pretty lengthy process. I think what we could be looking for here is it's just language in the ordinance that requires that, and I know also documentation of the original condition of the site was brought up, and that's a very valid point. That is something we can look at, but keep in mind in the SUP process, we get a lot of photographs, so that is photo documentation of the site prior to any use. And of course that's presented to CPC and the city council as all part of the background and research and everything that goes into taking a case forward in consideration of a land use. So, again, doing the SUP process for this helps in that regard. The other thing that I did want to mention, that currently the code does require that that the use for the temporary batch plants that they clear the site of all equipment, debris, and that they repair or replace any damage to public infrastructure as well before they leave the site. So, we do have some language in there now that that offers that protection. Also, the question was asked by ZOAC, how would the SUP process impact the current temporary concrete or asphalt batching plants that are not finished work yet on the site by that 6-month temporary time frame that they are under or required to be under, and when they request an extension. So again, as stated in the last meeting, what we're proposing with the SUP process now, as part of phase 1, would apply at the time of the effective date of the ordinance, meaning, whenever, if it's approved by city council, that would basically be the effective date. So it would be anything going forward. It would not be retroactive. We're not proposing that. So it would not have any changes to the SUP process. So what I can tell you now, and I did put that into the packet for you with the full SUP process and a link to that as well in the case report, but currently under the SUP process, an auto renewal, that use could be eligible for auto renewal, meaning they could renew their permit basically. If the applicant applies between 3 and 6 months prior to the expiration date of their SUP. So they become eligible, and then what happens is if they become eligible for auto renewal, then that then requires the director to send public notices to all owners within 200 feet of the SUP site or parameters. Now, again, this is the auto renewal with not going back through the process. So then when those notifications go out, if the owners of 20% or more of the land within 200 feet of that area of the SUP, if they file a written protest against the automatic renewal, the director then has to forward that application to the CPC and the city council for further action, meaning it will go back through the normal SUP process. So it's like starting over with a brand new SUP, basically. So that is that part of it. And I guess you also asked, oh, I'm sorry. So I guess the other part of that too, staff will review options and bring back recommendations for a specified limit on the number of renewals. Also, perhaps condition on performance regarding pollution and operating best management practices as part of phase 2. In other words, we'll take a look at that, how many times they can just keep auto renewing, because right now, as we know, the auto renewals kind of continue, and sometimes they're 5 years, sometimes they're 10 years, sometimes they're 20 years. I mean, it's definitely a process that can continue on and on. Another question that ZOAC asked, another great question, is requirements for streets and other public infrastructure to be repaired or restored back to original condition from any damages. Again, we do have language in there for the temporary batch plans, like I mentioned, but we will continue to review options. We can maybe look at something like performance bonds and other best management practices and other ways. I mentioned earlier about documenting prior condition to that site. But again, the SUP process would allow for that that documentation, good photo documentation of the site. But we'll definitely look at some other BMPs, best management practices, and others as part of phase 2. So with that, our next steps, again, we're asking ZOAC to forward the recommendations on to CPC of phase 1. But we anticipate bringing them to CPC in April. We'll continue to work on phase 2. If they're recommended by CPC, of course, we anticipate forwarding to City Council for final action approval and effective date of the ordinance again, which would set the SUP process in motion in May of this year. And then, so what happens if phase 1 is not approved? Well, we continue to get applications for temporary concrete and asphalt batching plants. And then the permanent batching plants in IM district will continue by right, with no public hearing processes, including locating in sensitive areas, near residences, schools, parks, etc., without a full public hearing process. And as you saw, also I provided in your packet, in the case report under the SUP. There are other measures that the City Council can take with SUPs. They can revoke them, they can bring them back, they can change them. So it's not, there's definitely some measures for this review and oversight, I guess you could say, through that SUP process. So with that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. I know that we have some speakers. Did I see you?
I have a question. All right, in the automatic renewals, you kind of go into an automatic process, which I've never been a huge fan of. But what happens in that automatic renewal process? In
Ms.
that,
Bagley, if I may interrupt you just one moment, we have some registered speakers today, and I wanted to give them an opportunity to speak
Sure,
before
no
we
problem.
go to questions. So if we could hold that thought for one moment, please. So Mr. King, I believe Mr. Reeves is online, but is not listed as a panelist. I don't know if you're able to move him. And then also I was going to ask.
I'm in now. I have been
Okay.
for quite a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. So with that, Mr. King, are any of our registered speakers online?
Yes, we have all four of our speakers are here.
Okay.
I'm going to start with Mr. Reyes. Unfortunately, I can't make him a panelist. I'm going to unmute him. I don't know why it won't let me make him a panelist.
Okay. Mr. Reyes, if you can make sure that your camera is turned on, we have to both see you to be able to take your comments as well as hear you.
Okay. I am connected, but I don't see myself on the screen, and my camera's on. So I don't know if it's something on my end or on you guys' end. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you at the moment.
Mike, do I
Okay.
need, I'm sorry, Mike, do I need to stop sharing my screen? Does that,
Yeah, that may help.
let me do that?
Yeah, I'm looking at the list of attendees, and I don't see a camera icon by my name. I just see the microphone. So I don't know what to do on my end to get on screen, because I just assumed that I was on the screen.
I understand. I think it may be because you're not a panelist at the moment. We're not able to do that. If I may suggest, could you perhaps log off and log back in, and then we will circle back to
Okay.
you and see if we can get that resolved.
Okay, I'm
Thank
about to
you.
log off. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And so our next speaker, Mrs. Neros.
Hi, good morning. My name is Janie Neros, and I live in the Singleton United Unidos neighborhood in West Dallas, specifically at 2821 Bedford Street, Dallas, Texas, 75212. I'm here today to support the first phase solution of mandating SUPs for all batch plans, both temporary and permanent. As phase 2 gets defined, I advocate for 1, increasing the buffer between batch plans and sensitive land uses to at least 1,500 feet, and 2, phasing out existing batch plans over time where existing facilities must come into compliance proactively by applying for SUPs 2 years after the ordinance passes. My neighborhood is inundated with industry, and we bear consequences when things go wrong. I'm actually currently working with the EPA to acquire access agreement signatures from businesses and residents in my neighborhood for the Texas vermiculite asbestos study. There's a need to test our soil for asbestos in our yards because it wasn't done 30 years ago when the company W.R. Grace, which is a vermiculite processing plant that used to be located just south of us near the railroad tracks, was discovered to have vermiculite contaminated with asbestos. W.R. Grace facility was demolished in 2001, 20 years ago, and soil sampling for asbestos was only conducted at that facility and not within our community at that time. So the fact that this soil testing is happening on my block now is an example of what can happen when industry is too close to residents and the things that can go wrong. It's reactive. So again, I'm here today to support the city being more proactive in implementing ordinances and policies that keep industry and people. Please increase that buffer between batch plants and sensitive land uses to at least 1,500 feet and require existing facilities to come into compliance proactively by applying for SUPs 2 years after the ordinance passes. Thank y'all so much for your work on this.
Thank you for being with us today, Mrs. Neros. Ms. Mayo.
Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Wonderful. So my name is Evelyn Mayo, and I live at 1030 Cedar Hill Avenue, Dallas, Texas 75208. I'm the chair of Downwinders at Risk, a local environmental justice organization. Downwinders at Risk is a member of the Coalition for Neighborhood Self-Determination, which is a multi-neighborhood coalition that is advocating for environmental justice, fair and affordable housing, and self-determination for all people in Dallas. As I mentioned at the previous meeting, the coalition has drafted an ordinance similar to the gas drilling ordinance and the ordinance that addresses the burning of hazardous waste in the city. Based on the scientific evidence about the harms of particulate matter pollution on public health, that same level of protection afforded in those previous ordinances is necessary from particulate matter pollution to promote health equity in Dallas. We applaud the planning staff and committee for taking on this important issue, and we are encouraged by the steps taken in phase 1 to require SUPs in all zoning districts. This was also included in the coalition's ordinance, which we circulated to you all last month. However, in phase 2, we are firmly advocating for a minimum of 1,500 feet in terms of a buffer from future and existing batch plans from sensitive land uses. The language for phase 2, which we recognize is not being addressed today, but still would like to highlight, as it's written now, would not impact existing batch plants, which are harming public health today. In contrast, the coalition's proposal ensures that existing batch plants must come into compliance systematically based on equity considerations to undo the existing pollution burden that is imposed on low-income communities and majority Black and brown neighborhoods. Once again, we are glad that this long overdue issue is being discussed, and we support the steps in phase 1 to require the SUP for all zoning districts, and we look forward to continued involvement in shaping this policy in phase 2. So thank you all so much for your time today.
Thank you for being with us. Next speaker, Ms. Bazan.
Good morning, Chairwoman. I'm Catherine Bazan, 10456 Vinemont Street. I commented at the February meeting, so I'm going to keep my comments brief. We do, unfortunately, in this city have heavy industrial and residential adjacency, as well as adjacency to other sensitive receptors. So I do support the requirement of an SUP in an IM district and in all other districts for both temporary and permanent uses. I do appreciate the thoughtful questions during the last meeting and the efforts to consider each aspect of the zoning code revision, but I would like to stress the urgency of these badly and long needed amendments. There have been 6 concrete batch applications or approvals recently that will not receive public hearing opportunities. Some of them did not even go to public notice and will just one day appear in these neighborhoods for what you have heard can be 6 months or longer. There is a current application in District 8 at the intersection of Crosswood and Robertson Drive in the College Park neighborhood. There's an application in District 10 in Lake Highlands at 9810 Athleta. This is directly next to residential property. There is a permanent application that was approved at 5000 Sion Road in District 7 that is near an elementary school, a neighborhood and parks. 3080 South Beltline Road in District 8 next to a very large mobile home community. The intersection of Alocasia and Copper Way in District 12 near the University of Texas at Dallas and their soccer fields. And then 3309 Pluto Street in District 6 in West Dallas, which is the second batch plant to locate next to Eladio or Martinez Elementary School in the past few months. It's never something that I would have considered in choosing the school that I send my children to, that I'd need to determine if there's industrial zoning adjacency, but this is the reality for West Dallas parents right now. Please send this to CPC so that it can go to the City Council as expeditiously as possible. Thank you. And I would just like to note Mr. Reyes is now locked out of attending this meeting, and I'm willing to put him on video chat from my end, if that is helpful to you, so that he can give his comments.
We lost Mr. Van Amber. If we can see him, even if it's on another device, I believe that will work. And that's what, Mr. King, are you able to see Mr. Reyes at all?
No, I'm not. And I've been trying to get him online, either into the attendee or panelist group. So is it possible to use video chat with Ms. Bazan?
We're checking that right now.
Okay.
But I think as long as we can see him, that will meet our rules. Mr. Van Amber, we have a question. One of our speakers is not able to be moved to an attendee. However, another is able to put him on video chat so that we could see him via her connection. Does that meet our rules?
Can we see what it looks like? If it looks like it's happening, then yes. As long as you can see the face and hear the voice and they're at the same time. This is different, but these are the times we live in.
Thank you, Ms. Bazan, for your assistance. Mr. Reyes, we are ready for your comments. And if you could start with your name and address, please.
Good morning. My name is Raul Reyes. I reside at 34 GER Street, Dallas, Texas, zip code 7512, which is the West Dallas area in District 6. I'm basically here just to support this process as it relates to making sure that we reform and update the ordinance as it relates to batch plants and cement plants on how they apply permits with the city. As many of us know on this call, Dallas is a community that historically has been disenfranchised. Because of that, many things have occurred in led to many of these cement or much of this IR zoning that's been allowed to continue in West Dallas. Also, West Dallas is being gentrified. So as a member of this community, and also I happen to be president of West Dallas One, which is a coalition of legacy neighborhoods and neighborhood association, we sometimes wonder how is it that this community is being gentrified? In other words, there's economic development coming into the area, and much of it is housing, but yet you have these IR zones that growth that's happening, not just in West Dallas, but throughout the whole city. I know there's much that we can get into in that discussion because a lot of it is historical, but as it relates to today, it is time to update ordinances and how we allow these type of industries to move into communities like ours that again there's have been allowed historically and still continue to operate because the ordinance have not caught up time. Definitely there needs to be voice of the community in this process. I'm glad that if it's approved, that it goes to an SUP process that allows for the community to have a say on what it is that they want in their community. And I hope that we're able to put a more, I'm not going to say stringent, but a more thorough process that allows for these type of industries that tend to always target my Black and brown community. To continue to exist. So again, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning and definitely support everyone that's in this process and trying to correct these wrongs that have been allowed in the past. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us, Mr. Reyes and Ms. Bazan, for helping make that work for us technology-wise. So we have any speakers here in person who wish to speak? Seeing none, I will thank our speakers again for being with us. Questions from our members. Ms. Bagley, I think you were starting us off.
Yes, in relation to the automatic renewals, will there be a process to review those renewals if there are complaints that are filed during that any time period of the SUP? You're saying if an applicant comes in 3 to 6 months before the SUP is due to expire, well, the approval of the renewal doesn't go back through the City Planning Commission. Well, complaints, how will you handle complaints? Will they be handled in the review of that automatic renewal? Okay.
think I'm understanding you. So yes, currently, if they do abide by that time frame, they become eligible for auto renewal. So then we're not changing that process for any that are already there at part of phase one, at least. I'm not sure about phase two. So we wouldn't be changing that part. That would still, that part would remain. However, any new ones coming forward through the SUP process, that's part of the SUP analysis, is determining and making that decision, which can be done through SUP, as to whether they become eligible for auto renewal. In other words, that can be put in the SUP that they're not eligible for auto renewal. And, or they can put, or it could be put a specific number of renewals, or renewal for only, X date, however length time. So again, that would be new going forward, but we're not, at least as part of phase one, not changing anything about the SUP process. That's not part of this, our parameters. We can't do that as part of this work.
That's not what I was asking. I was asking starting forward.
Can I just
forward, because there's no retroactive. I'm not looking at going back. I just want to acknowledge that in this SUP automatic renewal process, that the complaints would be taken into consideration for that renewal in the future, in phase one, phase two, whatever we go through. But I think we do need to have that in there going forward. I'm not trying to go back, although I'd like to at times, but I think it really needs to consider, because if there are letters coming in or notices or even phone calls about problems at the facility, that needs to really be up front in any renewals of an SUP anywhere.
So do I see, Ms. Giles, did you have a clarification for us on the SUP auto renewal process?
Yes, thank you. Andrea Gillis, I'm one of the assistant directors with Planning and Urban Design. And I just wanted to touch upon that I think that's part of the review for the review period during the automatic auto renewal. They have to submit in advance, and then all of those issues do get reviewed. So if there are complaints, those are things that need to get reviewed during that process.
I just wanted reassurance of that. Thank you.
No, that's a good question.
Thank you, Ms. Bagley. Other questions from our members online or those who are here today? Mr. Hall.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, is the standard SUP process, does that include public input? Not just the auto renewal part, but just anytime someone asks for a SUP, does we have to do public input? Is that correct?
That is correct, because there's public notification that is part of really any public hearing process, including SUPs. You have to notify within the parameters of of the ordinance, and and by doing that, that definitely gives the public that opportunity to voice their concerns and their opposition and support at that time. So that is all taken into account.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll ask one follow-up to that SUP discussion. As we look ahead to phase two and staff is considering conditions and regulations related to this, is a potential consideration that this use would not be eligible for automatic renewals? Is that correct?
That is correct. We are looking at the renewals as part of phase two, potentially, caps or, yes, we're definitely looking at the potential to possibly limiting how that renewal process works.
Clarification from our city attorney as well.
The automatic renewal process, I want to talk to staff about what they're doing, what they're considering bringing forward on that phase 2. I know there were some questions about how the automatic renewal could be challenged. And I don't know, and I know it's just generally said that, it's reviewed, and I think Andrea did a pretty good job on it. In the code, it's actually sort of the same exact process, 200 feet notice, 20% of the landowners complain, and then it goes forward through the process.
Standard process.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Van Amber. So I do have a second question, but before we go to second round, do we have any other questions from commissioners or members? Mr. McGrath? Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be back. A couple of questions. The first one for Mr. Vandenberg. Can you just confirm that as phase 1, as I understand, it's going to change, the gist is to change to require an SUP, but it'll happen going forward, not in the past. Has the language been reviewed to make sure that as we implement these changes, that none of them constitute a taking, because we will be limiting, I'll stop there.
Bert Vandenberg, Assistant City Attorney. Madam Chair, in response to the committee member's question, I can assure you that as the language goes forward, although it's already being looked at, it will be thoroughly vetted to prevent any possible interference with anybody's rights. It will result in non-conformance, but because it will not be retroactive. So.
Exactly. Okay. And I have a second question for you.
Yes, please.
And this one gets into the nitty gritty of the language changes. I don't want to do that too much, but I get it that the addition, the editing for code is essentially to include SUP in all instances. There's one that I don't understand. If Ms. Levy, if you can go to page 14 of your package, under Article 4 zoning regulations, it looks like we're adding a bunch of uses that weren't there. I don't understand what's happening here. Were you able to hear me, Ms. Levy? Are you able to hear me? Should I repeat?
Sorry. I think I believe I heard most of it. I didn't hear maybe the beginning, but I think you were asking about maybe the red lines, the language.
On page 14. Correct, on page 14. On page 14 only.
14.
Of the document, of the file. I'm not sure if you can.
Well, let me.
Yeah, it's on the bottom.
Oh, is this the camera?
Yeah.
No, this is the camera, right?
Sorry.
Can you see that?
I'm technologically challenged.
Oh, I'm pulling my document up. I'm sorry.
Oh, perfect. Better.
Okay. You said 14?
Yeah, of the electronic file.
Which item number?
The whole thing, the entire page looks like it's, if I understand this correctly, it's new language. Is that right? Are we adding new uses?
No.
Okay. So we're not, the only thing that's being added is everywhere where in each of those districts, and I've only redlined those to show you all of the districts where the language, you have to drill down. So then when you go to each of those sections, like for instance,
yeah, I think I understand now, Ms. Levy. I was the fact that this was in red, I was misinterpreting it as new language. I understand now what you're saying. You're just referencing these districts, and if it's not crossed out, it's not being rewritten.
Exactly, so just showing you everywhere that it's impacted. That's correct, and then that's why it's so long. Honestly, though, because because you have to go to each of those sections then to see where SUP was added for temporary concrete and asphalt batching plants, and approval by the building official is struck out, removed.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the question.
Commissioner Carpenter.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the question of auto renewals because I'm not sure there's a full understanding that in many situations where you have industrial residential adjacencies, it can be a very high threshold for the residents to meet that 20% of the property within the notification area. And, because of that, I think it would really be worth looking into when you go into the phase 2 to consider not giving these uses auto renewals, in the instance of equity, because there are just neighborhoods who are, have had this industrial residential adjacency inflicted on them, and I don't think they should have an undue burden to meet to have their concerns met.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter.
I have a couple of others, if I may.
Certainly.
Has there also been any consideration given to a prohibition against writing a PD that will reduce what we're expecting to be a required distance between these protected uses and the asphalt or concrete batches? Because what has happened in West Dallas, and this also addresses some comments that were made about your understanding of the SUP process, that there are photographs taken documenting the prior condition of these sites before these batch plants go in. Because all too often what happens, I can think of 4 instances in the last 10, 15 years where concrete batch plants just open up as renegade operations and sites where they don't have the zoning, they don't have the required separation from neighborhood, they don't have COs. And when they're reported, what happens, and then at that point, it's impossible to document what the prior condition was because, the operation's already in full swing. And when code comes out, they don't shut the operation down. They simply tell them that they, have to get legal, and then they withdraw all code efforts. All that process is going on, and that basically gives, what we're now acknowledging is a industrial outside use, not potentially compatible or incompatible to neighborhoods to just operate, for the 6, 8, 9, 10, 12 months it takes to, to get legal. At that point, what tends to happen is the city bends its efforts to find a way to make them legal, whether it's to write a PD or you reach a collective shrug which says, well, industrial use, industrial area, and these areas don't get treated, equitably. And then what happens? We've had these cases where these operations, which were renegade to begin with and not code compliant, stay a nuisance for their entire, operating life. They get shut down. I can give you 2 examples, one on West Commerce Street and another off West Commerce Street on Manila, where they were shut down by community prosecution, but the sites remain completely blighted. They look as if someone walked away from a batch plant, yesterday. There are piles of material. There's, tumbled fences. There's, concrete dust. There are wrecked pieces of equipment, and these sites do not get restored. So I think there's going to have to be some sort of more stringent procedures put into place for these operations that are shut down and that open up illegally. And have you given any consideration to writing or to having an ordinance that, once these places open up as renegade operations, should they be required to shut down until they get the proper permits, if it's the zoning and the permits, if that's even possible? Because otherwise what you're doing is subjecting neighborhoods to these renegade operations without any protection at all.
Those are very great comments, and I really appreciate that. It's something that we'll have to look at. Enforcement is kind of another realm, so we'll have to look at that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Carpenter, I have follow-up, but I think Mr. Dre has a comment for us.
I do have a clarification to ask. Is Commissioner Carpenter asking if the plant, the concrete batch plant can be closed during the SUP review process? That was the question. I just want to make sure I understood it.
And Commissioner Carpenter, if I may, the question was if it's an illegal use, and then they seek an SUP, are they allowed to continue their illegal operation pending the process? Is that correct?
At this point, yes, they are, because what code says is if they try to enforce any regulations at that point, it gives the presupposition that they have a right to be there. So they walk away from the site, and it's just allowed to operate during the process. And then once they're in operation, the city does whatever it takes to make them legal there. So my question is, why should they be operating in these locations, illegally? Why is the city enabling that for this process?
Okay, I'll get that.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. And I just have one follow-up, Ms. Levy, and I know this goes to our phase 2 and we're focused on phase 1, but as we're considering that, I think we've heard at our last meeting and in comments today that we sometimes see while there is information that is provided when the use ceases, could you confirm how that is either followed up on or what inspections take place to verify that the site is in fact clean and returned to a usable condition? And again, I think this is a phase 2 question as we think about this, just to make sure that there's clarity in how that is reviewed by the staff and if there's any other considerations.
Thank you. That is such a great question and something we do need to consider as part of phase 2. I am not comfortable answering, though, how it's currently inspected after the fact. I know that, as part of the permitting process right now, there's 2 parts. Once they're cleared, through all the ordinance requirements, they're issued a temporary permit, but then they still cannot legally operate until the site is inspected for all of the requirements to be met. So, and then they get a CO, certificate of occupancy, to operate. I think that's more of a question for permitting, as to how they're doing it now, inspecting it. I really am not comfortable saying that, answering that question, but
Understood. And again, I think it's a question just as we look ahead to phase 2. I expect we'll have additional questions on that. So if that could be part of staff consideration, that would be great. And I'm just going to make some final observations from our last comments that, again, I think would be helpful as we look ahead to the next phase. There was a lot of discussion about the number of batch plants that we have. And we're getting a little bit of interference here. So hopefully y'all can still hear me. So if we can understand the numbers and the geographic location in the city, I think would be helpful for the team or for the committee. And also there was discussion in the considerations of truck routing, which I think may be part of the current process, but having that confirmed. Again, site documentation prior to use, and also the post-CO site verification. I think those were the 3 items that I had heard from our last meeting. As we look ahead, if staff could just include those in their considerations.
I'm good on mine.
Okay, so I think as you can hear, we have our other meeting working to get started. So are there any final questions from our members? Mr. Reeves.
Yes, thank you. Back, probably thing, and this is questions regarding temporary SUPs. On page 8, we say at the time of applying for an SUP, the applicant shall do a site plan, the dimensions, location of the buildings, method of ingress and egress, off-street parking, screening, lighting, landscaping. For a temporary batch plant, should we also require the applicant to tell us what project they're actually working on? Because the idea is that the temporary batch plant is located near a certain project or projects. And so do we want to tie those projects to that temporary batch plant so that, when that project's done, they're done? Or they have to go back through the SUP process to get it? Because, I could see, I just want to keep kicking this can a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further. So that's just a question.
Yeah, and that is a great question and point, and I believe that's looked at now as to, for distance, but I don't see it in there either. So I think if it would be, written, more specifically in the requirements, that would be great for us to look at for phase 2. Thank you.
And that's all I had.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Any final comment, Mr. Barry?
Yes, I just wanted to echo some of the comments from Commissioner Carpenter and Ms. Bagley around in phase 2, not allowing the automatic renewal. I think that's very important. That's a lot of work on the part of the community if you're talking about an engagement every 6 months for this potentially, or however long the SUP is. I noticed on page 2 of the report, it does say unless the SUP states otherwise. So I think really emphasizing that, understanding that's outside of our purview for this piece. But in general, I'm supportive of this.
Thank you, Mr. Barry. So if there's no further comments, do we have a motion?
So, Madam Chair, can I check with you?
This is a motion to move, would be a motion to move this on,
Correct.
recommendations on to
I believe that there's
CPC.
correct. The request before us today is to consider
Phase
forwarding the request to CPC per staff recommendation for considerations of amending permanent and temporary concrete asphalt batching plant uses, including but not limited to amending potentially incompatible industrial uses in the Dallas Development Code.
I'm happy to make that motion.
I second it.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, and thank you, Commissioner Blair, for your second. Any discussion on the motion?
I'm sorry, did the motion include, was specific to phase 1?
Correct.
It is.
As read in the report. So with that clarification, no further discussion. I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
All right, motion passes. Thank you all, and I think we'll all be anxious to see phase 2 coming back. Thank you, Ms. Levy.
Thank you.
Other matters today, consideration of our minutes from the February 10th meeting.
Madam Chair, can I check with
Is there a
you?
motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Blair. Is there a second?
A second.
Second by Mr. Hall. Thank you. So motion to approve the minutes from February 10th, 2022 as submitted. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Our minutes are approved. And that concludes our agenda for today. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you for our speakers who were here today, Ms. Levy, staff, and the great discussion. I will adjourn the meeting at 10:02 a.m. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.